Patrick never set out to be a saint. He didn't even set out to be particularly a devout Christian. He was the son of a Roman official and had lived a relatively comfortable life. At the age of 16, however, he was kidnapped and made a slave in Israel. They put him to work tending animals. And to his masters, his life had no more value than the animals had, or perhaps his life had less value than the animals. He held little hope of ever seeing his home or his family again, but he clung to remembering who he was. In particular, he remembered the Christian faith he had been taught. Up until then, he'd been fairly indifferent to it. Now he spent much time reciting the prayers he'd heard since childhood. He still dreamed of escape, and after 6 years managed to take the risk and get back to his home village. His family found that their Patrick had changed. He'd gone through a terrible ordeal, and his faith had taken a profound hold upon him. As he studied for the priesthood in Gaul, he had a series of dreams. Irish voices, the voices of those who had inflicted slavery and suffering upon him. They cried out to him to return and walk among them once more. There's no evidence that Patrick even hesitated. His superiors dragged their feet, thinking he didn't have the learning or the skills for such a dangerous mission. But Patrick himself wanted to go. He wanted to help the people who had injured him. And Patrick stands in a grand tradition of those who triumphed over their suffering to such an extent they managed to do some of what Jesus had done. Look how Jesus responded to his own suffering. Our humanness may find this the hardest to fathom. He forgave those who were crucifying him. And forgiveness isn't easy. It's too easily misunderstood also in today's world. Forgiving someone, for example, doesn't mean the one who inflicts an injury may not have to face the consequences of what they've done. And forgiveness doesn't necessarily remove or reverse the injury. When Jesus forgave his executioners, it didn't take the nails out of his hands and feet. He still suffered the terrible death they inflicted upon him. It's also unrealistic to think forgiveness always means the injury is forgotten. However, it can be remembered in a different way. We don't have to compound it with bitterness or with hatred. That's easily said, of course, not so easily done. I'd like to say I'd achieved it, but there are some wounds I've struggled to truly forgive, perhaps forgiven on some level and not on others. I try not to nurse my wounds, try not to keep anger alive, but honesty compels me to admit that I have not forgiven everything. This is despite the fact that I know my lack of forgiveness only harms me. The people who did it don't care, or in some cases might not even remember the injury they caused or care about it. Some of them have died, so I'm the only one carrying the burden. What can we do when we find it truly hard to forgive? Well, one author suggests praying for healing as well as for the ability to forgive. And that seems wise. We can offer the injuries and the offenders up to God as Jesus did. In any case, his words of forgiveness were not offered to those who engineered his crucifixion. They were spoken to God and overheard by others. The executioners were doing a job they'd been ordered to accomplish. His forgiveness must have seemed irrelevant to some or maybe all the soldiers. The others, the one who plotted the whole thing, well, they didn't care. They apparently felt quite righteous about the whole situation. Jesus didn't speak to them, but he offered these people up to God, asking God not to hold it against them. Another aspect of prayer that we can do is simply offer to God our difficulty with forgiveness and put it in God's hands. Asking for that ability along with it. And for those who want to be forgiving, who want to mean the full prayer Jesus taught, but still find it difficult, there does remain a comfort. God is better at forgiving than we are. In the meantime, we'll have to struggle on the best we know how. In reading stories of the saints, I've been impressed by the fact that they weren't perfect either. Of course, I never thought saints actually were perfect, just that their negative side usually got unremembered in light of their positive qualities. And apparently even that isn't the case. One I read about was just a little too fond of contentious arguments. Another one never bathed or changed his clothing, so folks found him unpleasant in person. Others were a little harsher to their critics than they should have been. Some made decisions that to their time and culture may have seemed appropriate, but to ours seem incomprehensible or downright wrong. One example, Brother Juniper was a Franciscan monk who was kindly and charitable to a degree few of the Franciscans themselves even managed. But one day a sick brother mentioned his desire for eating a pig's foot. Brother Juniper ran out, found a pig, and cut off its foot to make some soup. It caused some serious embarrassment, although the pig's owner eventually acknowledged Brother Juniper's example of charity. On the other hand, although Juniper also gave his own belongings away, in this case he had been charitable at someone else's expense. And yet in the end, when I think of this story, it's all about, oh, that poor pig. To acknowledge the failures of those so-called saints is not an excuse to establish a lower standard of behavior as acceptable in Christian life. We can't say he was a saint and had trouble forgiving or loving or stopping an argument, so that's all right for us not to do the same things. What it does mean is that grace is powerful. It also means that God doesn't use perfect people to do the work of faith. God uses people like us, and great things are still accomplished. Amen.